Welcome to the Retail Insider video interview series. I'm your host, Craig Patterson, and we're joined here with a special guest, Daniel Ritchie. He's a retail veteran with all kinds of experience in all kinds of areas. Also, you're doing distribution with Dr. Vranjes here in Canada. Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Pleasure. I'm really happy to be here and to talk about my experiences over the last, God, it's 45 years. I've
It's
been
been a while.
in the retail business. So yeah, it's a long time. But, it started for me back in Montreal in 1978 when I joined Holt Renfrew. And I joined them there as the traffic manager, looking after the movement of products into the country and around the country. And at the time, the business was owned by Carter Hawley Hale, a big US conglomerate who, over the course of the previous 15 to 20 years, had put together regional department store chains into a bigger group, like Emporium Capwell from San Francisco and Thalheimer's from Virginia and Wanamaker's from Philadelphia. And then, of course, the jewels in the crown, Neiman Marcus, Bergdorf Goodman, and eventually Holt Renfrew, which prior to that had been privately owned by the Walker family. So it was a really good introduction because at the time, in the late 70s, early 80s, with Carter Hawley Hale, we had an opportunity to interact with our colleagues across North America and go to conferences and learn about different ways of doing things and look at economies of scale. But like everything else, those things sometimes come tumbling down when they don't keep up with the times. And, we've seen over the years what's happened to the department store business in Canada, but also in the US. All these regional players are gone now. Eventually they all got sucked up into Macy's and Bloomingdale's, I suppose. But it was a fun time. It was a heady time in retail. Until 1986, when Gale and Weston came along and said, I think I'd like to try this. So the Weston family, through their private investment holding company, Whittington Investment, bought Holt Renfrew from Carter Hawley Hale in 1986. And then we started on a new journey with a new team of people, change at the top. The president was swapped out. We went on from there. During the time I was there, couldn't say that the company made a lot of money, couldn't say that the company lost a lot of money. It was kind of just a wipe your face situation. They were looking for their niche. We spent a lot of time refocusing our buying team on ensuring that we didn't have any overlap. Previously, we had a lot of buyers who had specific remits, but there were overlapping suppliers and so on. So it was a matter of cleaning all that up and getting some focus. And we brought in a retail consulting group to help with that. Management Horizons, actually, out of the UK. So it was a lot of fun. It helped us to reinvent the business. At the same time, we were starting to look at profitability by store, expanding in some markets, closing down other markets, getting out of suburban stores in both, mostly in Montreal, but in Quebec City, and even in Winnipeg, where we had multiple stores, and then looking for the right format to roll forward. We had a couple of shops that were designed by the Watt Group, famous for their involvement with the Westons and Loblaws in particular, working through with Dave Nichol from President's Choice at the time. But they became just a little bit too pedestrian. They weren't special enough for our consumers, so they didn't really survive in the long run. But it was a great experience. I was there for 15 years and then rode off into the sunset, as you do, to try something different.
Daniel, you were there when Holt Renfrew relocated its store on Bloor Street from, I think it was 144 Bloor Street, which was about a 60,000 square foot tall, narrow store, to the current flagship location, which is located at 50 Bloor Street West. What was that transition like to create that flagship store, which is still there today on Bloor Street? It's a little bigger and looks a little different.
It is a lot bigger and it looks a lot different. Yeah. But at the time, my major focus at the time, my role at the time, was to get the products in that were going to fill that store, less so about how it was run and managed. But the interesting thing was that store opened in 1979, but it never really took off. We had trouble almost from day one creating that buzz and that excitement and that customer focus that we needed. And it was one of the major reasons that the business decided to up stakes in Montreal and move its head office to Toronto. And in doing that, there's a theory that the store that has the biggest buzz and the biggest opportunity is always the one that the merchants have their eye on. So our buying office, our head office, when we moved, was actually right in the store, in the part of the shop today that is homeware and you know, the accessories, the things that are up that little staircase when you go through the store to the east side. That was the buying office back then. And you know, eventually it's all been turned into retail space, which was the right thing to do. But at the time, having the buyers actually physically have to walk through the store multiple times a day is what really put focus on what customers needed in Toronto, because the markets are all very different, as you know. So that was a big benefit. And I think it was then that Toronto suddenly started to take off and Bloor Street became the #1 store in the chain.
Interesting. What happened with Montreal? It closed a while ago, a flagship store on Sherbrooke Street. Now there's of course Holt, Renfrew, Ogilvy, but Montreal saw a bit of a downturn in its retail from the late '70s, I think, into the '80s.
I would say that it did. I mean, it was a time when we had a number of suburban stores in Montreal as well, in Dorval and Laval, in several different places, and we had even hotel lobbies like the Four Seasons and Ritz Carlton. So, you know, we looked at profitability around all those models and started to pull it back in, and really focus on the main shops. At the time would have been Fairview in the West End, Rockland, which we renovated and rebuilt. We had left Rockland and came back when the project, the mall was actually being renovated, and really focused on a fewer parts of the city and a fewer consumer profiles. And we were at the time trading in that beautiful 1300 Sherbrooke Street Art Deco building. That was actually an amalgamation of a couple of buildings. So you would get off on one floor and you'd have to figure out where you needed to get to go to the other floor. But over time, I guess the one thing about that building is that you couldn't do much with it in terms of expansion. And each floor's footprint was really tiny. You talked about that Bloor Street store, the old one at 144. Sherbrooke was similar to that. It was a lot of, it was 7 or 8 floors, all small footprints, and you couldn't do a whole lot with it. So I think when the Ogilvy thing came along, and I was long gone by then, but I think it made sense for Holtz to look at how they could actually do the things they wanted to do in a more productive way.
Oh yeah, and now going to say Western Canada, the Vancouver store at the Pacific Centre had already been opened by the time you joined Holt Renfrew. I think that was around
Yes,
'75 that it opened.
yeah, it was already there. And again, that's a footprint that changed dramatically over the years from then to what it is today. But Vancouver was a city that was starting to catch fire then. There was an influx of Asians, particularly Japanese tourists. So it was a matter of how you catered to them and how you got money out of that population when they arrived in the city, because they weren't there for that long. But over time it grew. There was always speculation that we would have a second store in Vancouver. There was talk around Oak Ridge. There was talk around Royal Plaza Royale in North Vancouver. And then ultimately we ended up with a store in Whistler, which was in the new Chateau Whistler. It never really took off. It was hard to merchandise. The problem was you never knew who was going to be in town. Profiles were so different, wildly different.
And it was tiny. I remember
was,
this about '91, I think it opened.
Yeah. And the other challenge that we always had in Vancouver was around being able to get the brands that we wanted in the shop, because there were a couple of stores that had been around forever, like Leone's and Boboli and Biblos, and they had these brands that you really needed at the time locked up, so you couldn't get them. And that meant that we had to have, in some regards, brands that were not as popular. I'm sure the platform has changed completely today, but back then it was a challenge. You just couldn't get the brands that you wanted to have.
Yeah. Now let's talk Western Canada a little bit more. I remember when I was a kid, a new Holt Renfrew opened in Edmonton. It left Jasper Avenue and moved to the Manulife Center.
Yep.
Because you would have been in there around that time too. That was around 82,
It was
83, I think.
80 or 82, I think. Yeah. Yeah. I was there at the time. We were on a expansion kick. We were looking for property in Calgary because we had a terrible shop on 8th Avenue. And then we had Chinook. And eventually we opened downtown Calgary as part of that new Eaton Center development and closed Chinook. And it was a similar thing at Edmonton. We had an old tired store and we went into that brand new Manulife Center. Made a huge difference to the business. And we were quite a force in Edmonton for a long time. Similarly with Ottawa, we opened Ottawa on Spark Street in 1978. And it was a great little store for the longest time, but that whole Ottawa market has changed so dramatically now that you just couldn't, they eventually left Spark Street. I think it was partly an access issue too. You couldn't get to the store all that easily. So, it was on a mall on one side, a pedestrian mall. So that was a challenge. And then in Winnipeg, same thing. We had 2 stores in Winnipeg. We eventually got rid of one and just traded. We were in Polo Park and downtown. Eventually, when Portage Place was redeveloped, we went in there and ditched the Polo Park store. So lots of change over time. Quebec City, similar story. The Legacy store in downtown Quebec on Broad Street was eventually closed, and all the attention was put onto Saint Foy. And it remains there. It remains there. So that's where the consumer has migrated to. Downtown in a lot of Canadian cities is just not that important anymore.
And what happened to the Quebec City population? We actually discussed this before, where there was an aging of a bit of the carriage trade, and that the younger generation may have
I
gone
think
elsewhere.
suburbs. I think there's a fair number of people during that time frame who left Quebec City completely because of opportunity or lack thereof. The population aged, but those who stuck around didn't stay in the downtown core. So they were in Saint Foy, they were in Charlottesville, they were in communities that were more, the sleepy town communities, suburban communities around the city. So trying to get somebody downtown was a real challenge. And the other thing that I don't think you can discount is that one of the things that changed the profile during those days with Holt's was that it was very much reliant on a fur trade that was disappearing for obvious reasons. People, were moving away from real furs to have faux furs or no furs at all. And I think that was a big change. I mean, the Holt Renfrew business really revolved around the fur trade back in 1837. And that was there even until, not that long ago, where you had not just the sale of fur coats, you also had the summer storage of fur coats. And that was a massive business for Holt's. We had in the Montreal store, we had a massive fur vault that was 2 stories high in the building adjacent to the main store. And it was temperature controlled and all that sort of thing. And we had similar fur storage businesses right across Canada, which were supplemented by or led by, depending on the city, the actual sale of fur coats. So, as that changed, it really changed the business big time. And that's something that I think is probably a Quebec City tale all on its own, because Quebec City, those customers were either gone or dead. Nobody was wearing furs anymore.
That is so interesting. And the stores, like say at Polo Park in Winnipeg, do you remember how large they were? They were smaller, sort of boutique size,
They
or
were
what would?
smaller. They probably were in and around 5,000 to 6,000 square feet. They weren't huge stores. Maybe stretching to 10,000 square feet in some cases, but they weren't big stores. They were definitely not big stores.
That is so interesting. And today, all the Holt Renfrew stores are quite big. I think the smallest one is about 130,000 square feet, at least in gross square footage. And I think that's the Yorkdale store in Toronto. Still big.
Yeah. Yeah, well, considering that it's their biggest volume, the productivity per square foot is really and pretty good in a place like Yorkdale, isn't it?
It sure is. Oh my goodness. Now, after Holt Renfrew, you'd left in 1993. You went to, you were VP of operations at Bretton's.
I was there for a short time. There were a number of people that were at Bretton's or in the e-tax sales group. One of them I had a really great relationship with. His name was Alfred Chan. And he owned e-tax sales with his brother. And e-tax sales was an importer exporter kind of business. And not at the high end, in the low end. But he had bought Ports International from the family that owned it and was running that. And then he bought Bretton's and couldn't figure out then, Alfred was the kind of guy who would buy something and then try and figure out what to do with it. So it wasn't strategic. It was just kind of, let's have a bigger piece of the pie. So at the time, I went there. He had brought Don Evans in. I don't know if you knew Don Evans. He was the president of Tip Top for years and years and years. Anyway, Alfred brought him in. And it wasn't too long before the parent company got itself into a massive amount of trouble. And the divisions all just started falling like dominoes, whether it was Ports or Tabby at the time. It was also part of the group, or others. It just, didn't have a happy ending. He had bought Bretton's from C&A Group because they could never make it work. It ended up being, for them, just a store full of their own brands. And over time, that's not what the customer was looking for. They didn't want another place where they would just go and buy things they could get down the mall and in a freestanding store. So the time frame there was really short. I worked with Alfred and Don on trying to reestablish Bretton's, and then I worked with the receivers on trying to sell it. And then eventually with the liquidator to get the best amount of money out of the assets that we possibly could. But it was too bad, really, because I think at the time the country could have supported something that was that bridge between department store and a specialty store. I don't know where that market even is today, to be honest. I don't think it exists in the same way that it did then. And what we've seen is not just that go away, but the entire mass market of mid-market of department stores doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. I remember Bretton's being a teenager. I'd buy my Alfred Sung jeans on sale. But they had a area for fragrances, I remember, including for men. They didn't seem to have a lot of footwear, but it's very much a fashion store, I think.
Oh yeah. It was a fashion store. We had all the brands that we needed in that mid market, but it maybe just wasn't special enough for the right people to shop at, and we definitely couldn't sell it to anybody. We tried. There were a number of suitors, but I think at the end they were more tire kickers just to try and figure out what was going on in the business than actually serious purchasers.
And the locations were interesting for Bretton's too. The flagship, well, I mean, it was started in Ottawa. I think I'm just going by memory from being younger and doing some research, of course, as well.
Center.
Yeah, Rideau Center. I know there was one at the Manulife Center in Toronto, but there was like Metropolis at Metrotown and Burnaby in the Vancouver area. We had West Edmonton Mall. Calgary had Market Mall. I'm trying to remember now.
Oh, Calgary was Chinook.
Chinook, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, but what they were looking at the time was trying to identify by market where the right customer was that Holt Renfrew wasn't. So in Ottawa, Rideau Center, far away enough from Spark Street, and then there was a second store in Saint Laurent Mall to capture that suburban market. When it came to Toronto, the first store here was actually Promenade. And it opened before Bloor Street did. Couple of years before Bloor Street did. Bloor Street was a suicide mission from the beginning. Nobody ever expected that store was going to survive, and it didn't. And it sucked dry a lot of money from the rest of the chain. But yeah, Chinook again, Holt Renfrew had left Chinook, so there was a theory that there was an opening there. Vancouver at the time, there really was nothing available in the downtown core. It was pretty tight. So the thought was, let's go out to Burnaby, to Metrotown, and that's where the store ended up. But all those stores were in place by the time I arrived. I was there, at the beginning of the end, not the end of the beginning.
Do you remember Creed's was in the same shopping center as Breton's, the Manulife Center in Edmonton?
Creed's was the big competition to Holt's and Bloor Street, and Creed's, they lived and died also on the fur trade. And their business started to get really tough when furs really became not very popular anymore. And they were running a massive fur storage business that just very quickly over a few years evaporated. So yeah, it was a great business, a great family. They're still around doing a few things here and there, but I don't think that Breton's was ever a challenge to Creed's, or just would have been a completely different customer. I couldn't imagine a Creed's customer who was probably a little more Tony even than Holt Renfrew. I couldn't imagine them going into a Breton store ever.
How did Holt's and Creed's interact off of each other, or in terms of consumers? Creed's was almost I don't want to say the fancier store, but I think at the time with Chanel and Ungaro and a few of the other brands, or Valentino, I think that Creed's might have had things locked up for a little bit there compared to Holt's, maybe.
They did. It was a similar challenge to what Holt's faced in Vancouver. The brands that they really coveted, they couldn't get because Creed's had them. And then, at a certain point, Holt's tried to build a different proposition to go after things like Ralph Lauren, the top of the range, and built a huge Ralph Lauren boutique inside Bloor Street. And similarly went after Yves Saint Laurent at a time when Yves Saint Laurent was probably not at its best. So there were challenges there. As you say, Creed's had all the big name brands, so it was difficult. And I think one of the things Holt's did and did well was that they had the fashion eye to be able to identify what the up and coming brands were. So, getting in on the ground floor with some of those people made a huge difference.
Yeah, and also we had a recession, 1991. Creed's left. We lost a lot of stores at the Hazelton Lanes as well, which was probably one of the world's top luxury malls, at least in terms of the brands that were available there, from the late 70s, I think, until the early 90s. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole downtown phenomenon. It's not really just one thing. I think you have an overstored situation for the customer profile you're chasing. But I think that it's become really difficult to shop downtown. You look at trying to access some of the stores along that, $1 million mile or whatever they call it on Bloor Street. And it's a challenge just to find parking. It's a challenge to find a point of difference, somewhere where you want to be, that you feel you want to be, that you don't have to trudge from store to store in the heat of the summer or the freezing cold of the snowy winter. So, that whole downtown vibe I find so different than it used to be. And you look at some of the things that have popped up along Bloor Street. Fabricland is coming. I look.
It's open. I went to the opening. It was a couple of days ago.
Right, Fabric on Bloor Street across from Holt Renfrew. I think that's hilarious.
No, it's quite yeah. I mean, it was a fun tour, but it's not the right location for that retailer. I agree completely.
No, I can't imagine who's going to go shop there unless you've got young kids who are in fashion school or like to sew, and they go to Holt's and they remember what they saw and they run across the street and buy the fabric to make it themselves. But it's a weird place for them to be. I'm sure there's a real estate play going on, but it's bizarre.
Let's talk about Dialex next here. You were working, I think, more with Tip Top Tailors because there was a CCA situation, right?
Yeah, I was VP Ops at Tip Top. We were in the process of trying to reinvent the business, cutting down layers of management. I think when I got there were underneath in my portfolio there were 160 or 180 stores, so it was way overstored. We didn't really have a great handle on stores that should be closed because of, four-wall losses. And then when we did, sometimes we were tied into the lease because of the corporation more than the brand. So, we had to be there because it was good for Fairweather and all the other Byway and whoever else was there at the time. So that was a challenge. But in my portfolio, I had 3 regional managers, and each regional manager had about 8 or 10 district managers. And like by the time you narrowed it down, you ended up with a situation where each store manager, each district manager had maybe 3 to 5 shops to manage, which really meant that a store manager wasn't making any decisions. They were just there. So what we tried to do was blow that all away. And we went from this massive structure to just having 8 regional managers across the country and nobody below them. So each one of them then had between 15 and 20 stores. And then store managers, we had to go on this massive re-education program so that they would have the skill set to actually run a business. So it was a lot of fun. And I know that it was the beginning of a great turnaround, but again, with Tip Top, we struggled because the top of the pyramid fell down. And it was a really sad ending, because I know of one senior corporate executive who actually took his own life because his savings were completely wiped out. He had nothing. He went from being somebody with great home in Toronto and cottage country and all sorts of things, to having absolutely nothing to his name, and he couldn't cope with it. And when those things happen, it really drives home the reality of lots of different things, but the humanity of it. But also, if there's a lesson in it, the lesson is eggs in one basket really is not a good idea. So again, I worked with the liquidator there because of the experience I'd had at ETAC at Bretton's. The president of Tip Top actually said to me, "You know what? You've got a handle on how all this works. So even though there's the CFO, I'm going to get you to run the cash flow, because you know how to do it, and you know how to get money out of the liquidator, the court-appointed monitors they were at that point, and you know how to forecast what cash we need, what cash we have. So I was actually doing all of that work. It was a lot of fun, but at the same time, I was being courted by Nuance, it was Alders at the time, to go and run their merchandising team.
This is 1995, right?
Yeah, but 95, not being sure where the Tip Top thing was going to fall out, especially after the Bretton's experience. I thought it made more sense for me to take an opportunity when it was in front of me. And I wasn't at Alders for more than 6 months when Nuance came along and bought the business. So that changed things dramatically, because at the time, Alders was a joint venture between Alders department stores in the UK and an engineering firm in Canada, who really had no skin in the business except for money and because you needed a partner. Foreign companies couldn't own businesses in Canada back in those days. You had to have a Canadian majority shareholder. So they found someone who was completely disinterested in the actual running of the business. And it was an engineering firm from Mississauga, and they were the majority shareholder. So what was curious was that some of the people in the team worked for the Canadian business. Like my team of people worked for the Canadian business, but I actually worked for the UK. And at the time when that divorce happened and Nuance was coming in, there was a massive due diligence project, and my office was deemed to be the soil of the Brits and not of the Canadian team. So all the confidential documents and everything were in my office, surrounded me in boxes, until all that due diligence took place and things shook out. But it was a tough situation, because it was one of those things where a fish swallowed a whale. And then the whales said, great, because Nuance at the time was a very tiny player. They bought this massive duty-free business, and they bought it on the basis that there was going to be all kinds of economies of scale in this global business, and they never really materialized. So it was a challenge, and I know that it actually brought down the CEO at the time. It was René Deflon, crazy Swiss guy. Loved him, absolutely loved him. But the business just didn't have enough direction. We worked on all of these committees and groups and different project teams where we were looking for ways to save money and get more margin from suppliers and all that sort of thing. And it just never happened. The assumptions before they bought the business were not very good.
That is so interesting. The first time I ever heard of alders, actually, or the first time I ever saw something was, and I'm not joking, an episode of Mr. Bean when I was younger. It's where Mr. Bean is crawling to the cosmetic section, kind of choking, whatever. So I knew as a kid when I saw that there was an Alders duty-free store in Vancouver, it was the same name and the same logo, and I was quite confused. Of course, then
Yep.
became a nuance duty free. We're in Canada. The stores were in, I think, Vancouver at the airport and downtown. Were they in Toronto at all? Do you remember? I don't remember back then. No.
We had Pearson Airport as well, and we had Calgary.
Okay.
So and we had satellite stores in Banff, for example. So yeah, it was across Canada, but we also were running the US business. So we had the Las Vegas airport, we had concessions at the Boston airport at Logan. But our biggest US business, which was really quite interesting, was the cruise ship business. And we had big, vital lines like Holland America and Celebrity. And we ran all the shops on board. So all of the people working in the stores on the retail, in the retail shops on the cruise ship worked for us. And that was a fun part of doing store visits, because you would get on at one port and they're only allowed to open when they're at sea. So if you want to see a shop in operation, you can't do it from a dock. You have to sail, which was such a hardship. So you just bop around, get on in Fort Lauderdale and jump off in the Bahamas, or jump on in the Bahamas and jump off in Puerto Rico or whatever. And so that was a lot of fun. A really tough business, because just like in airport retail, the rent margins are so ridiculously high. What you've got to promise in order to get the contract leaves you like pennies on the dollar to kind of squeeze out. And if you can't squeeze them out, you're going to lose a lot of money.
Now with the duty free in Vancouver, so there was a big duty free store in downtown Vancouver that closed in the early 2000s. It was actually, I think, at that point being run by Aldiesa, the Spanish group, which had bought out Nuance and had fired everybody. I know, because I know they fired the store manager, because he's a good friend of mine. But let's talk about downtown Vancouver for a moment, because things have changed with duty free. We don't have stores in Banff anymore. I don't know if the law has changed. Do you have any insight into that?
It has. I think that customer behavior has changed, and I think that back in the day, you used to get the most lucrative customer group were the Japanese tourists, and Japanese tourists don't wander. They don't do things on their own. They're not what we call independent packs. They are tour group packs. So they stay as a group, they go everywhere as a group, whether it's the hotel, the restaurants, the shopping, the entertainment, they do it all together, a busload at a time. So what's happened over time is a number of things. First of all, the prices were really good in Canada for a Japanese consumer, because there was a level of distribution in Japan that had layer on layer on layer on layer that made things really expensive. And the Japanese renovated their economy back in the late 90s, early 2000s to take a lot of those layers out. So suddenly goods were not as wildly advantageous to them from a price point of view. Second thing that happened was that the younger Japanese consumer was becoming more independent, and they didn't want to have to shop in these big groups and go on the bus and everything else. So, when they started venturing out on their own, the world changed. Then, whereas back in the day, you had people that came to Vancouver, they spent a couple of days in Vancouver, then they would be bused to or flown to Calgary. They would do Lake Louise and Banff, back to Calgary, and then back to Japan, or vice versa, Calgary and then Vancouver. It didn't matter. But that golden triangle suddenly started to become more about Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Japanese tourists started going into places where they never really went before. And I think the biggest benefactor of that was Las Vegas. And you saw this massive influx of Japanese tourists into Las Vegas. So as the customer changed, I think the need for having this store, massively expensive store in downtown Vancouver, became less obvious. So over time, it just didn't really have a place anymore.
And I have some bizarre insider information too, because I met the former head of Old I think he was from Spain and then was living in Vancouver and then ended up, I think, going to Miami afterwards. But there was a lawsuit. I'm trying to remember everything that was involved, but the gist of it was a tour bus parking spot in front of the duty-free store was taken out. And this had a profound impact on sales because there were tour groups. They ended up started coming from China after the Japanese weren't coming to Vancouver quite as much to shop. But I think the sales at that store went from over $70 million a year to something like 3.2 million. It was such
I was there when I was there. That store was a $50 million store back in the
50.
Yeah, it was by far the biggest thing that Alders had in their group as an individual unit. Some of the Australian stores were good too. They had Sydney, they had Brisbane, and they were great, but they had multiple stores in those locations. So individually, they didn't have one that was as big as, the other place we had, which was really hilarious, was we had Washington, D.C., the international airport terminal, but we also had a downtown store in Washington. And it was a completely different focus because it wasn't Japanese, it was Koreans. And all they wanted were Burberry raincoats. So we used to have to make sure that we had this massive selection of Burberry raincoats when the Koreans showed up, because that's what they wanted. It just shows you how much is driven by consumer behavior. And in some ways, there are things you can do to mitigate the changes and go with them. In other ways, you just can't. So the business morphs around you and you can't do anything about it.
Interesting. Now, do you remember in Vancouver, it may have been around the time, I think it was around the time you were there, DFS duty free, which still exists. I think it's actually part of LVMH now, but had opened a store in the Carlisle, which is now a luxury shopping center towards Alberni and Thurlow streets, but I don't think it got a license. Do you remember anything about that?
No, they hadn't opened when I was there, but their idea was to open and have it as a duty paid shop and just trade off their name, because at the time DFS was huge in the Far East, so they owned Singapore and Hong Kong and Macau and actually a lot of Australia too. The difference at the time was that in some markets like Australia, you could have multiple duty-free players trading against each other. In Canada, it's an exclusive contract. So whoever wins the bid has the exclusive rights to run the business. So it was a little bit different, but they had such a massive play in the Far East. It was just crazy. And they also had San Francisco, they had Los Angeles, they had a big off-airport store in Koreatown in LA. And they had a big store in San Francisco as well. Over time, I think those businesses have all shrunk down, but still an important part of what they do. And yes, you're right, they are owned by LVMH. LVMH bought the business as a way to goose their beauty brands, really. Same reason that Sephora was interesting for them.
Yeah, yeah, that is so interesting. I mean, I find the duty free interesting. I've been watching that for years. It seems like such a waste that DFS, the store was about 25,000 square feet on Alberni Street and was a failure. I don't know how long it was open for. Like we're thinking like, I don't know, 2 to 3 years or something. It was shocking.
Yeah, well, at the time, I mean, people are still price conscious, but if you could control the tour guides, you win. I mean, it came down to that. But that was the thing about duty free is, first of all, the rents were extortion. But then you had to pay everybody off all along the food chain. You had to pay the tour guides, you had to pay the bus driver, you had to pay everybody all along the way. So you really had to hope there was something left at the end.
This is fascinating. After duty free, you got into well, I think you went into a bit of a quote unquote retirement. You're never going to retire, are you, Daniel? But I mean, you got some franchises for the body shop, right?
I've proven over time I'm not good at retirement. So, and I think most people who are really serious to retire are dead in 6 months. But yeah, I bought a body shop store. One of the guys that worked for me as a regional at Tip Top, I had said to him once upon a time, just keep your ear to the ground if anything pops up, because he had gone to the body shop as the director of sales. So one day, out of the blue, he called me and he said, "The store near Mills is for sale. You should probably talk to the current owner." So I did that. Very quickly made a deal. I think that was in January of 1999, and by May I had taken the store over, and I loved it because it was a chance to do my own thing. It was a chance to control my own destiny. It was a chance to get back with the customer again. There was nothing more invigorating than spending time on the floor talking to the folks that came in. And it was in the heady days of the body shop. I mean, business was booming. Sales per square foot in Canada were the highest in the world. You made a lot of money. I mean, it was always outrageous to me that a store that did 1.4 million a year did 60% of that in 4 weeks at Christmas. But you learned a lot about how to run a business, because if you didn't come out of Christmas strong, you wouldn't make it to the next Christmas. You kind of had to bide your time and make sure you had enough cash to feed everybody that needed to be fed in the store. But at the time, Anita was still there. She was still actively involved in the business, and it was when she pulled back and handed it over to other people to run, and then eventually sold it to L'Oreal, that it got really, really difficult. They started to do things that they've never recovered from, like taking the refill program out of the stores. When you've got a clear point of difference and a competitive advantage on the green economy, and you suddenly decide that you're going to move away from that, it's a really interesting, I guess is the right word, move to make. And it was things like that were the beginning of the end. I used to have a bin in the stores where people would bring in their empty containers for recycling. And the business got rid of all of those things that made it unique and different, and went to more of a corporate, global position, even with product. At the time, we used to have a buyer, a vessel buyer, who would go to the various trade shows and find the right containers for us to build our gifts in every Christmas. And then we had a choice. Either we could buy our pre-made gifts in these vessels from the head office in Canada, or we could have the vessels sent to us and we could have our own little cottage industry building them ourselves. I always bought them because I didn't want the mess. But they took all that away, and they went from having these great containers that you could use after the fact for all sorts of different things to having these standard boxes that all looked the same and had no real character or point of difference. And the other thing that we were doing at the time, we were sourcing all of our accessories centrally in Canada. And they took all that out and started doing it as a global proposition. We were actually bringing product into Canada and filling all the bottles here. It was all filled here in a facility in Don Mills. And they took all that away and did everything centrally for North America out of Wake Forest, New Jersey, and North Carolina. And it just changed the whole complexion of the brand. And they went through some really tough times, and I don't think they've recovered. I don't think they'll ever recover. L'Oreal sold them to Natura. They've just working on replacing the CEO again for Body Shop. So in the meantime, L'Oreal has bought Aesop, which I thought was really interesting because they screwed up the Body Shop. Here we go again.
That's so interesting. You got it. Let's talk a bit about the Middle East, because you continued sort of in the beauty space, but in a different realm, and then you've got some stuff happening here in modern days as well here with Dr. Vranjes. But let's talk a little bit about the Middle East, because you were saying earlier that you found some interesting learnings about how things were done differently and how to be open-minded.
They were. You have to go there with an open mind. And the problem with the West is that we only know what we're told by the press and the media. And at the time, the region, it's had a bad name for a long time for various reasons. But what I discovered when I went there was I could either spend my time pointing out things that I thought they were doing wrong, or I could change my paradigm and say, it's not really wrong if they don't know another way. It's just different. So I had to look at it from a different point of view, because if you aren't unable to do that, you'll never survive in that region. It's really, it really is quite an eye-opening cultural experience. But I absolutely loved it. And I went in running the beauty halls for the company I was working for, Al Shaya, which is the largest franchise retailer in the world, running out of Little Kuwait. And their success has really been very simple. They find brands that have an affinity to the consumers in the region, and then they bring those brands to the region, make a franchise deal, and just replicate. So they're not merchants, they're not store designers, they are property led. So for them, I mean, being able to sit down with a new mall development and say to the guy, we really like the mall you're building, we'll take 30% of the space, and then we'll decide how to divvy that up amongst our brands. I mean, it's not quite that simple, but it is that simple. And this company has its arms in all different industries. So we had a massive food business with Cheesecake Factory, P.F. Chang's, 1,200 Starbucks locations in about 15 different countries. When I arrived there, the company had, I think, 15,000 employees. When I left, it was close to 50,000 employees. When I got there, the company had about 35 brands that it represented in the region. When I left, it was about 75 brands. And I had a couple of roles. One is to run the beauty halls. And at the time, we had the franchise rights for Debenhams. And in fact, it's the only place in the world that I'm aware of where Debenhams is still running bricks and mortar, because they made a deal with the new owners to just keep going. Whereas in the UK, it's an online business only. And then we had Harvey Nichols, for example. And then we had a standalone perfumery chain that was competing with Sephora at the time. But part of my role, which became really exciting, was to find brands that we would bring and open freestanding stores for, like Charlotte Tilbury, like NYX, which was very popular, and a host of others. And one of the brands that I found on my journey was Dr. Vranjes. And we brought it to the region and started opening stores for it. Of course, if you know the consumer in the Middle East, fragrance is what it's all about. I mean, people here would laugh when I tell them that 65% of my sales are fragrance in the beauty hall, whereas here they'd be lucky to be 20% of sales. It's here it's more about skincare and then makeup. In the Middle East, it was about 65% was fragrance, and then you had a makeup business of 20 or 30%, and then you had 5 to 10%, which was skincare. And people would say to me, well, the conditions there, why would they not be more engaged in skincare regimes? Simple, because they're never outside. They go from the house to the car, to the mall, and back again. So in the Middle East, when in Kuwait, it's 55 degrees in the summer. You're not out walking. Just not done. So you have that aspect of it. And then the other aspect, which is becoming less of an issue, but certainly in 2010 was in its prime, the women there are covered up, especially in a place like Saudi Arabia. So, between not being outside and being covered up, they didn't really feel the same kind of need to take on a skincare regime. That's changing now because they're catching up with where everybody else is, particularly because they spend more time on their mobile phones. On Twitter, the highest usage of Twitter per capita in the world is Saudi Arabia. Most people don't know that.
Wow.
But there's nothing else to do, so that's what they do. Their entertainment is all about connecting online. So great opportunity. I brought a lot of brands to the region. One of the brands I brought was Dr. Vranjes. And after I came back to Canada, they contacted me to say, hey, we don't have anybody in Canada. Would you be interested in taking the brand on? So I didn't have to think too hard. I jumped on it pretty quickly, got up and running pretty quickly. We're about 18 months in distribution in Canada now. And we have 3 online channels, one of which is our own, drvranjes.ca. We have Amazon and the Bay, but we also have 16 retail partners across Canada in major cities, in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. So we're in the process of looking for more of those, and you can never have too many retail partners if they know what to do with your brand. So we're actively looking for more retail distribution, at the same time actively growing our own website business, because obviously that's where the margin is.
And tell me a bit about the products, because I even got a couple of them. There's everything from the home. You've got kind of diffusers, or tell me a little bit about. You'll be able to describe it better than I will be able to.
We're broken down into 3 major categories. We have our diffuser line, which starts with a 100 ml refill, 100 ml room spray. And then we've got an assortment of diffusers that start at 250 ml and go up to 5,000 ml. So that's really meant for big spaces. And then the second category that we dance around in is candles. And again, our candles start from a very small 80-gram candle all the way up to a 6-kilogram candle, which is massive again. And then our third category that we're doing in Canada is car parfum, which is a diffuser for your car. We have 14 different scents that we carry in Canada. We've got the most popular ones. And the scents are broken down into 2 categories. There's what we call collection and then traditional. We have 3 collection fragrances that tend to be about 20% more money than the traditional. And then we have 11 in the traditional range. And the brand is constantly developing and growing. And we have some very interesting points of difference. I think the biggest one for me is that we have a refill program. So with some of our competition, you buy a diffuser, and when it's empty, you have to throw it out and buy a new one. With ours, you can buy a refill and just keep topping it up. And every time you buy a refill, we give you a new set of reed sticks. So your thing always looks fresh. Your diffuser looks fresh. It performs better. It looks better. And then we also have aside from the refill program, we have a gift set program. And we traditionally do gift sets in 2 ways. We have a holiday assortment and we have an everyday assortment. So we've got something for everybody, really, at really good prices. And our opening price point for a diffuser is $110. It's not a lot of money if you consider the value you get out of it. And the refill is half the price for that container. So it's not that it's half the price. It's double the amount of liquid. So for almost the same price that you're paying for the diffuser. So that works out well for us, and we see big things ahead.
Excellent. And yes, like you said, you're looking for more retailers in Canada in terms of distribution of Dr. Vranjes. So we'll have some links in the show notes. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you, say retailers, if they're interested in carrying the line?
best way it would be through the website, which is drvranjes.ca. You'll probably need to spell that out for them because it's a tricky name to pronounce, and I hear it pronounced 100 different ways a day, which is always entertaining. And there is a Dr. Vranjes. He's still there. He's still active. He's still working in the business. He's still doing all the product and scent development. So it's not like it's just an invented name. And the magical thing is that this year is the 40th anniversary of the brand. So it's been around for a while, not in Canada, but in the US for sure. Big in the Far East, big in the Middle East, and pretty big in Europe, primarily Italy, France, Spain, and the UK, where you expect it to be. So all systems go on Dr. Vranjes. I'm really excited about what we've created so far, and I think the next little while we're going to just explode. It's a category, Craig, that I find is really on trend. It got goosed a lot by COVID because people found new ways of doing lots of different things. But people stay home more frequently now. They entertain at home more frequently now. So our products are great to give that atmosphere to your home. They're also great as hostess gifts, to bring somebody a diffuser or a gift set or a candle. It's just really easy to do.
Thank you so much again, Daniel Ritchie, for joining us today.
Thank you for your time.
And thank you so much, everyone, whether or not you're watching this on our YouTube channel or listening to this on one of our podcast channels. I'm Craig Patterson. I'm the founder. I'm the publisher and CEO of Retail Insider Media. Thank you so much again for joining us here today. Take care and bye for now.